Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this wrap-up session for State of the Nation, our first ever digital forum. I think it's been pretty successful based on the number of people who've been watching. I hope you do as well. This session's going to roll pretty much the same way the rest of our sessions have. We'll be having a chat across our panel members, and we'll let you, as the audience, ask some questions. Before we get into that, I should not assume that you all know who I am. So for those of you who I haven't introduced myself to, I am Melinda Salento. I am the CEO of the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. Joining me for our panel discussion are the people who've been facilitating our sessions today. We've got Diane Smith-Gander AO, who is, of course, the National Chairman of CEDA. Ming Long. Ming, this morning when I did my introductory comments, I'm sorry I forgot to acknowledge your recent Queen's birthday gong. So Ming Long AM, CEDA board member, and Jared Ball, who is CEDA's very own chief economist. Before I throw to the panellists, we again have Pigeonhole running. Hopefully by now you know where to find that, but if not, it's ceda.pigeonhole.at, and today's password is SON2. We will be putting up a question for you. We'd love to get your responses. The question for this session is, what do you see as the most critical issue for Australia's future that we've discussed today at State of the Nation? So I look forward to seeing your results there, and of course get your questions up, because the sooner you do that, the more likely it is that we'll be able to answer them. And then, of course, it goes without saying that we'd love you to keep tweeting and tag us at CEDA_news. I'm not going to go in order of sessions today. I'm sorry, Jared. I'm going to kick you to the curb just for a moment. But I am going to start with Diane, because I think most people were pretty interested to see how your session with Sally and Christian went this morning. So perhaps over to you for your sort of highlights from that conversation.
Thanks very much, Melinda. You know, over my career, I think I have actually made somewhat of a career out of stating something that I think is bleedingly obvious, but other people then go, oh, you know, or maybe I was just the brave soul who said it. So actually in my session today, it was the Attorney General's turn to state the bleedingly obvious. And given my intro, you'll see I mean that as a compliment, not as a negative thing. So what was the bleedingly obvious thing that he said? He said some pre-COVID jobs will just not be sustainable. He then went on to say what that meant. Now, when you talk about some, in our previous world, it's not a very big number, but in a COVID world, some can be an absolutely huge number. So we've got some jobs that are not sustainable, and the implication of that is that a lot of people who are currently on JobKeeper, and we know that's about 3 million people, could join the 800,000 people that have been added to JobSeeker. So the question becomes, what will happen to the amount of money that people who are now on JobSeeker gets after September? And I think this decision about what that number is going to be is becoming one of the most critical decisions we're going to make, and that became really obvious during that session. So I was really encouraged by the session, as I said at the end, but it was actually Rajiv Viswanathan in Ming's session, the CEO of Indigenous Business Australia, who I think elegantly encapsulated the big thing, the big idea. He said we need to see all of this through the lens of opportunity, not the lens of deficit. He was, of course, talking about Indigenous disadvantage, but I think you can apply this very well to everything we've been talking about. And he went on to say we need to have meaningful, genuine and ethical partnerships. And I think that's what's been happening so far between the Secretary of the ACTU and the Attorney General. And I'm really hoping that that can continue for a bit longer, in fact, actually a lot longer, because I think that's what will get us to a place where the Australian people want us to be, because you look at the pigeonhole questions we had and you look at the poll question that was yesterday in my treasurer panel, where everyone is saying we really want this this partnership, this sense of bipartisanship to continue over the next little while. So for me, that's the big thought that's come out of this State of the Nation.
Yeah, I think really, really interesting points there, Diane. And I think what I sort of caught the first part of your session, and one of the things that struck me was when Christian Porter was talking about putting some of the numbers on the table around the number of jobs lost. And I guess I was sort of joining the dots in terms of the number of jobs created that the Prime Minister was talking about at the very start of State of the Nation. Big numbers, but nothing compared to the jobs that we've seen that have been lost. And so it was a moment of pause, because it does go directly to what you were talking about, which is what do we think about JobKeeper, JobSeeker, long run? The Prime Minister also made a comment in his comments on the first day around, he used this term, the dynamism of the labour market. And that's code, I think, for the fact that the policymakers are thinking about what the longer-term impact of some of these payments is on the labour market and how it functions. So I think there's a lot of interesting conversation to still go under the bridge, if you like, around what these payments do, how long we sustain them, and what the impact is. And I think the other thing, to your point, Raj's comment about ethical decision-making, I think that's what Sally McManus was trying to say too in her opening comments around. I think my take on it was we're playing ball now, we're playing fair, we understand we're in this terrible crisis, but please understand that we're not going to be wanting to have a conversation about keeping the circumstances and the new rules of the game for the crisis forevermore. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Ming, this sort of I guess the other phrase that's sort of come through this whole conference has been the sort of pink recession. And I was really intrigued by the real interest coming through our questions and responses to the surveys around the sort of pink recession and blue-collar job creation, which I think Sally talked about as well. And the focus on young people in particular, I'm sure those themes would have come out in your session. What do you think the key takeouts have been for you from the session you facilitated, but more broadly?
Oh dear. While Ming's gathering her thoughts, I've just realised I'm wearing a pink shirt and Jared's got a blue one.
You're out, Diane, and Jared's in.
I'm wearing my pink one next time.
Look, for me, that was actually quite interesting that through every single session, everyone's talked about the impact on women and young people. And obviously, I do want to also bring through our Indigenous Australians as well, because we're seeing that theme come through, and that theme's been there forever, but it does need to be highlighted as well, because the disadvantage they face is intergenerational. But there's I think a pretty broad consensus that we actually need to make sure that whatever policies we come through address the areas of most disadvantage, because the other piece that came out of my session is that there's a recognition that if we address those that are most disadvantaged, it is actually going to be the piece that drives the economic growth and job creation that the government's actually looking for. So it's going to be, I think, the engine room if we can make sure that we're lifting all of these people sort of into more secure financial circumstances, or just out of financial insecurity. The other theme that's certainly come out of my session is voice, and making sure that there's a diversity of voices giving advice to government in terms of crafting their policies for the future. We hear it through the Uluru Statement for the Heart. First Nations want a voice and want a seat at the table to add their perspective to how we should craft policies in the future. We absolutely heard it from Karim, who who's spoken to so many young Australians all over the country, and wanting to have the youth voice that was there before refunded. And certainly, the theme that came out of, I think, your session, Diane, too, is having a voice for the unemployed. in terms of crafting policies for the future. So making sure, I think, that, you know, people who are sitting in positions of power, we can come from very narrow backgrounds, and having a diversity of perspective will make the policy decision-making much more inclusive and probably more effective on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, thanks, Ming. I'm sure we'll come back to those themes in terms of, you know, the question, I think, for CEDA around some of the issues that we take out of these past 2 days and sort of advance through our own research and through the use of our voice, if I can put it that way. Jared, obviously, we've been doing a fair bit of work on supply chains, you know, straight out of the gate, really. Once COVID hit, we at CEDA repositioned our research agenda to try to tap into some of those topics that we knew were going to be fundamental, not just in responding to the crisis, but, you know, from a longer term perspective, looking at future growth opportunities. What were the key takeouts from your session? And, you know, feel free to plug some of your own blogs and research.
Well, I think the words that are ringing in my ears were Austrade CEO Stephanie Fay said, we can trade our way out of this, but we need to be really smart about it. And she spoke about the need to have a relentless focus on our competitive strengths and align that with things like research and development. So really talking about, you know, how can we go further, whether it's mining equipment and technology, whether it's higher up the agricultural value chain, education, so many more things. So she was really cautiously optimistic. We have everything within our grasp to be able to do this, but we need to get, you know, really relentless, really strategic, really smart. And that's not just government. That's not just up to government. That's right across the economy. So I think that was really interesting. Interestingly, with our poll, we asked whether Australia could influence, you know, the free movement of goods and services, given the rising protectionism. 1/3 of people thought that we could, and then the other 2/3 was split between being unsure and saying no. And it was interesting that you know, Stephanie and I finished off talking about the fact that Australia has continued to pursue free trade. We've continued to have bilateral agreements that we sign amid all of this rising global sentiment. So I think that we should be pretty encouraged by that, but also not being naive about the fact that we've got some challenges there in terms of getting a lot more smart and strategic in terms of our exports.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to just grab onto that last theme around global engagement, because one of the really interesting things that came out of my session, I thought, which was looking at critical services and how quickly some of these key businesses in electricity, you know, AGL, Aussie Post and NBN Co had actually responded to the crisis. And one of the things that came out particularly, you know, talking to Christine from Aussie Post and Will from NBN Co, was that the very first thing they did was reach out to other businesses around the world, businesses in their sector, to try to understand, in countries that had already been really severely affected by COVID, what were the sorts of changes they were going to have to make, what was the scale or the enormity of the task. And that was the very first thing they did. And I think that's a really interesting lesson, so that even at this point in time when we're sort of feeling very island-like and our borders are closed, that was what people did to sort of reach out and try to understand how we should best respond. My sense from their conversations was that a lot of what they saw, they didn't necessarily want to emulate here, but it did help them understand the sorts of adjustments and how quickly they were going to have to move if they got ahead of it. A couple of other really quick things which I think tie in to some comments made by you, Jared, but also Ming, coming out of your session. The thing, when you talk to people who've led these businesses, the pace of change and the scale of change that they've implemented is just extraordinary. If anyone wants a lesson on big numbers, please do watch the live stream that I did with Christine Holgate, because the numbers that she was quoting were just phenomenal. So this massive scale of change, the pace of change so fast, the agility that these businesses have shown is just incredible. And I think there's a narrative in Australia that's too often about how we lack dynamism, our businesses are non-responsive, we can't do this stuff, and particularly our bigger businesses. And there we had 3 very large businesses show how they stepped up and how they transformed themselves to deliver things, services and products to people that were critically essential through the crisis. They built confidence, they built and maintained their connections to the community. They reasserted the pride in essential services, I think, and did so in a way that let the community know that those services could be relied on. And I really hope that that's a message that sort of comes through. And Ming, I think that community connectedness point, that they've used this as a period in time to actually completely reaffirm that. And I think Brett told this great story about how people were calling into their call centres and actually inquiring about the people working for AGL. That to me is a big shift. And if we want to talk about shifts that we want to hold on to, I hope that's one that we hold on to.
But don't you think, Melinda, why does it need a crisis? You know, we should not need a crisis to drive us to be more innovative and agile. And that's the thing I am concerned about, is that, you know, I think there's a growing level of complacency. Hey, we got through it, it's okay, you know, levels are low. And then I can see that sort of inertia creeping back in, and we don't have to move as fast. We don't have to change as fast. Let's just stay now as we are. Or my greatest fear is to go back to how things were. That's the scary piece for me, because we in some respects, I don't feel like we moved fast enough in the crisis and learned as much as we could have. If, you know, I don't want the crisis to be longer, but I want that urgency to remain, certainly in business, because the 4th industrial revolution is here, you know, like beyond all of these immediacy of these crises, you know, pandemic, hopefully it's only every 100 years. We've got climate change coming through, 4th industrial, there's so much disruption coming through. And if the one thing we can keep, you know, doing is that agility to change, to try things, to make mistakes, and okay that it worked, and let's do something different. Don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's that was a question I posed to the 3 panelists in my session around. I kind of liken this experience. Everyone feel like the survey that we asked was the question we asked was do people think that there are permanent changes that are going to stick? Right? No surprises. 98% of respondents said, "Yep, we think things are going to change." And I think that's great, and I hope they do. But I sort of likened it to your New Year's resolution.
Yeah.
And,
yes.
And the point about that is, if we want things to change, we have to be really deliberate about it, right? Now, the lesson on decision making from the people, from Christine and Brett and Will, that they've taken out of this is that they haven't deferred decisions, so no procrastination, and delegation. They've empowered people to make decisions all the way down their organisation. And I think that's going to be the challenge, right, is to keep those sorts of changes. And so now I'm looking at you, Diane. How do you drive that cultural shift into business?
Oh, isn't that the question? You know, and one of the things that I do is I chair Safe Work Australia, which is the member body for such. And Safe Work's an agency, which is a policy body. But during this crisis, there was real pull for one single voice about work, health and safety matters. Interestingly, of course, the Attorney General and Minister for IR is the responsible minister for that agency. And so rather than meeting 3 times a year, the members were meeting every 2 weeks, you know, every week. And Safe Work was doing what in the past would have been regarded as a really, you know, unnatural act of actually issuing a lot more advice and, you know, a single national set of advice without going through lots of different committees and interest groups and so forth. And you could see people really responding to the crisis, but you could also see norm reversion happening at times. And so I think there is not just business, but also government and many of the regulatory agencies that have done amazing work, you know, through this period and now have a different way of working. So how do we keep that culture change right through, you know, not just business, but also government? And, you know, at the end of the day, I know when we talk about changes, in energy usage and so forth, we always say, well, it's going to be the consumer at the end of the day. And I think this is what's going to be different this time around, because everybody has experienced this change. It hasn't been some change that we've tried to insert top down through the organisation in response to strategic threats that leadership sees. This is something that everybody sees and understands now. And so everyone's experienced working from home. Everyone's understood the risk profile is lower. So the change agenda, the change problem is really different to what it's been in the past. And I think that's the thing that will allow culture change to be lasting. But leaders have got to be alert enough to see this and understand this and go, well, I need to throw out the change management playbook and build a new playbook really fast that relies on the fact that I do have this lived experience across my whole workforce, and then step into that. That's what I think will make the difference, but it does require very savvy leadership. And that's exactly the same thing for government.
Yeah, thanks, Diane. I think it's a big challenge, and I think we're all going to have to work pretty hard on it. I'm going to go to the questions now, because one of the questions really goes to where we were going to take the conversation anyway, which is from Clotilde. I hope I've pronounced that name correctly. And Jared, I'm going to flip it your way if that's okay, because the question is, how will CEDA support Australia's economic recovery from this crisis? And I know as our sort of chief economist and leader of our research program, that's been front and centre for you. We've already shifted things, as I've said, a little bit, but maybe just talk quickly about what we're going to do research-wise, and then I'm going to put Ming and Diane on the spot to say what came out of the conference for them that they think we should be thinking a bit more about at CEDA.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things there. I think in the immediate term, we are working with people around what does the transition look like. And it's interesting that at the beginning of this crisis, policymakers talked about a bridge to the other side. I think there's going to be a lot of bridges. And I think, as Andrew Charlton talked about yesterday, the wall of money. Well, the wall of money simply, the idea that this will simply come to a cliff and it will end, it's just not going to happen if we want to have a really, seamless kind of move out of this crisis. So I think one thing is that we will certainly be adding to the debate and research around what some of those, immediate kind of issues are and how we start to get stronger job creation coming out of this. I think the other thing that we will do is focus really strongly around technology. It's an area that we've clearly marked out in terms of our policy priorities and bringing together business, government, community sectors to talk about how we can keep this momentum up in terms of the change that we've just been talking about. What are the policy settings that we're going to need, and how we're going to keep the pressure on and keep ourselves accountable in terms of making some of those big changes. And that is also going to involve some big changes in areas like innovation and research and development as well. So very much looking at some of those short-term things that we can do in terms of the policy debates that are going to be critical in that transition, but then moving into the longer term in terms of those things that we know are going to be really important in terms of Australia's long-term economic development.
Yeah, I think that the two things probably worth just kind of emphasising as well that don't go so much directly to the research topics themselves of the policy work that we'll be doing directly, but a bit to how we're looking to do things. And for anyone who's been following CEDA's work over the last couple of years, hopefully one of the things that's become obvious is that this theme about how we connect the community to the benefits of economic growth and to the challenges of economic growth, and actually make sure that we've got policies that speak to the community and policies that connect to the community in a way that they feel that they've got ownership of them and a say in those conversations, and that they feel they're important to them. So I think that's one thing to really call out as well, just in terms of how we're doing the work that we do. And so, for instance, on technology, of course, Jared, the focus on public interest technology and how we make sure that the community feels that they're benefiting from this and this isn't a one-sided equation. And I think the telehealth examples that we've seen and talked about, including through this conference, give the community a sense of the real benefits that they can get. And we really need to jump on that and make sure that the community understands there is a balanced consideration of new technologies, but there's benefits there as well, and there are risks of not going faster on some of these things. And so I think that, and then secondly, of course, we're really keen to engage our members and hear their voices and their insights on really important issues, for instance, the workplace relations agenda and what that means to them from the perspective of how they can create jobs, really. So, Diane, what do you think? Anything that came out in the last 2 days that you think is going to have to bump its way up our agenda?
Yeah, Melinda, it's really interesting because I think what we've discovered in so many other places is that what this crisis has done is it's accelerated and it's deepened trends that were already there before. So if an issue isn't still on the agenda, it sadly meant that we were probably on the wrong topic before. Now, I don't think that's the case in too many places. So you've just mentioned public interest technology. If we'd been a bit further down that conversation, maybe more Australians would have signed up to the COVID Safe app. So while I've got that on my list, folks, when you go to a restaurant now in WA, you have to give your name and your phone number. Who knows what they're doing with that? But we know it's for contact tracing. If you're prepared to do that, for heaven's sakes, get a hold of that COVID Safe app and sign up. Even if you're not 100% sure about the technology, we all do need to sign up because this is the way that we will keep the great outcomes we've had continuing on. So with that short advertisement, the other really big thing that I think is going to be important on our agenda is to continue our focus and work on migration, because this is an economy that's benefited from migration, permanent and temporary, in many ways. It's given us critical mass that we otherwise wouldn't have had, and it's also made us a way more diverse and vibrant society. So we're now in a situation where the borders are closed, migration's going to be harder, we've got major dislocations in the economy, we've got a great deal more unemployed people that can drive into some of the sad xenophobia that we have from time to time. So I think CEDA is going to have to continue to be a really solid voice of reason and outline the opportunity that's available through migration. So that's one of my personal hotspots.
Yeah, thanks. I think a really important call out. History tells us which direction that conversation's heading in, and if there aren't voices on the other side, it takes a long time. And of course, you know, you spend a big amount of your time in WA, and there are plenty of businesses there that rely very heavily on skilled workers. So as well as the rest of the economy, really, in terms of bringing productive workers into the economy. So a really important call out. Ming, how about...
Melinda, at the moment the border closed, I spend 100% of my time in WA.
I know. I'm actually trying not to draw attention to the fact that you guys have still got your border closed. Ming, what's on your mind?
So many things. I'm so glad you mentioned migration, Diane, because it's always better when a not obvious migrant mentions migration. But I do think, and I just think about our membership, I want to make sure that when I think about the membership we have, that we don't lose the voice of our younger Australians, because really everything we do, they have to live with much longer than we do. And, you know, if you listen to their concern, there are so many concerns there that need to also bubble up that we need to take into account. So, you know, we didn't spend a lot of time today, for example, talking about their concerns around climate and climate change and the opportunity that also presents in terms of, you know, electrification of our nation. There's the whole infrastructure piece that can come from, you know, building a circular economy, which would actually just make us so much more resilient in the long run too, right? You know, they're concerned about the social cohesion piece and all the sexism and racism, and we do a lot of work already on that inequality piece and disrupting disadvantage was actually very important, that work there. But also I think what you're doing now, you know, even having a State of the Nation sort of online and digital, and the fact that it is so much more accessible now to people that maybe have thought in the past they didn't have access to it. And, you know, do we need to, from a CEDA perspective, do more of these things actually online so that we can reach more Australians, even people who aren't members, so they actually understand what we're trying to do here?
Yeah, I think it's a great challenge to us, and I think the answer is simply yes. I think the idea that we'll go back to business as usual as an organisation in the way that we run these fantastic face-to-face events, and they have a real purpose, and they are, there is nothing like a face-to-face event in terms of the quality of the conversation that you can have and the way that people engage in it. And I mean, we all know this. We watch things on live stream. There are definitely moments when we're not 100% involved in that conversation. But I think what we've really seen through this is the level of engagement, the number of people logging in to watch these different sessions, the questions coming through. We know when we see who's engaging that there are people who haven't been to our face-to-face events before. So we are absolutely going to have to jump into this. I think.
Yeah. And I think in particular there, I think what we see from COVID is that we've been able to reach not just a couple of cities, it's regional Australias that really, get left behind on so many resourcing, infrastructure, on so many things, but at least we can bring them, discussions around what's happening at CEDA and what we're doing on these really big issues.
It's interesting because I was talking to a member who was talking about how they are planning on doing much less international travel. They're in the resources sector. And what they actually mentioned was that when some of their team would go to other countries to engage with senior execs there on big projects, they still weren't meeting the people who were out in the regions working at the projects themselves. And so they were still having to sort of either not connect with them or VC into those people. And they said, well, if we're going to do that, we may as well just do it all from where we are anyway. And their experience has been that people have been much more connected. Their employees have been much more connected. So I think there's real lessons in that. I just wanted to go to your point quickly about the circular economy because you must be a mind reader. That came up as one of the questions that's come through. We've talked a lot about rebuilding our economy, but we haven't talked about the circular economy. And I think this sort of highlights a challenge for us in how we frame the recovery, because too often I think we see the climate issue as climate versus economy. And at the beginning of the year, really, it's amazing how quickly we've sort of moved to this other new crisis. And there's the bushfire. We still need to learn the lessons from the bushfire crisis. And what everyone was talking about then was climate resilience, climate adaptation, etc. And I think there's a challenge for us around how we recover, and it's not just which activities but even within every sector, how are you thinking about these broader issues around circular economy, around the environment, and how can we reset the type of growth and the sort of quality of growth, if you like, to sort of embed these things in a way where perhaps we haven't done that as well as we might in the past. Jared, what about you? Anything else from you that stands out from the conference?
I think just picking up on both points that you and Ming have made around our governance and our decision-making and making sure that people feel connected to that. We know from OECD studies pre-COVID that this was a real issue in terms of trust in government and democracies. We've benefited greatly during this crisis from rapid decision-making, but we need to transition, back to normal in a way that we are connecting our decision-making with people in the community so that people do feel that they've been heard and that they are part of policy making, because otherwise policies are not going to stick.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one of the themes that's come through pretty strongly throughout the conference is an interest in how national cabinets functioned. And if we go back to decision-making, one of the things we talked to Andrew Charlton about, given his experience through the GFC, and in fact, Gordon de Brouwer, another CEDA board member, was, what you learn, what you take from these decision-making processes and governance through a crisis, but recognising that at some point you've got to get back to normal. And sometimes that back to normal does mean engagement with community, it does mean transparency, it does mean consultation and all the rest of it. So I think we'll watch that space with interest. Everyone's very hopeful that national cabinet and state-federal collaboration lives on. What about you, Diane? Is the West going to...
Well, we feel like we've seceded, but joking aside, there was a really interesting moment talking to the treasurers yesterday when all of a sudden they started talking about, well, we don't have any budgets. We're supposed to have done budgets by now. We'll do a budget at some point. And, one of the reasons why National Cabinet works so well is because we don't have the election cycle looming, and that sort of seems to have taken a very different flavour into those rooms. And I thought, hang on a tick, I can't imagine how we really run Australia as a democracy without elections or budgets in the longer term. So I do have to sort of wag my finger and say I think that's going to change somewhat. But you can just see how, imagine just thinking a while back, we're probably going to punt elections like many other countries have done if we're not in a state, to be really ready to hold them in a safe, appropriate way. We've put off something that's always been so central as the budget. Now, if that can happen, think of all of the other things that can happen. So let's not just revert back to the old way. I think it's just another riff on this. Let's see this horrible thing as having some silver linings, work out where they are and grab them and go very hard.
Yeah. I loved how you wrapped in knuckles over the hand. Yes, I was listening. I thought, whoa, okay. Goodness, Diane's made a point. But I think what also brings to light through that discussion you had, Diane, is the shorter. So the delaying the budget actually probably extended their mindset. There's the immediacy of the crisis, but then it's the longer-term decision-making that I still feel like I'm not sure if we've really addressed that problem, because some of the things that we need to make, our country more resilient requires that longer-term thinking. It has to go beyond the next election cycle. And, I don't think we've cracked that nut, unfortunately.
Yeah, and we do it in corporate Australia as well. I was having a conversation recently with a proxy advisor about executive remuneration, and we were talking about, how long the cycle should be for the vesting of long-term executive incentives, which are the things that are supposed to keep people focused on strategy and keep them looking into the long term. And immediately it got conflated with CEO tenure. And you go, hang on a second, what is just the long-term picture of a company and the tenure of an individual CEO actually need to be conflated? And why does the future of the country have to be conflated with an election cycle? It's a really sort of strange dynamic, and somehow we need to break through it. But, boy, there's a philosophical topic for the next State of the Nation.
I can tell you I do not want to put exec-rem onto the conference. For my sins, I've had too much to do with that, wearing a different hat, and I would prefer never to have to do it again. I'm going to finish. I've got to run through the results from the survey. Mitchell, you sent through a great question on technology. I'm sorry I haven't got time to answer it, but if you go onto CEDA's website and have a look at our public interest technology agenda, I think you'll get a sense of what we think the role that we think we can play there and what we're trying to do to build community confidence in technology. The poll results, it is resounding. I find this fascinating and heartening, if I'm honest. What do people think really matters in terms of the topics that we've talked about? 39% protecting the most vulnerable, and 61% creating jobs. So it is jobs. And I think that's probably a sense, it's where we started our conversation around, yes, we've got infrastructure programs that look like they'll be positive from jobs, from a jobs perspective, but we've got a mountain ahead of us, as the Prime Minister himself said. Thank you to the panellists. I am just going to give a bit of a full wrap up now. I think you're going to have to sit there and watch me. I apologise. I'll be quick. But thanks for your comments today. To the audience, thank you. It's been an interesting couple of days for us. Certainly, I think the conversations have been incredible. We've definitely enjoyed and really appreciated the contributions from so many of our members and other stakeholders. Can I close by once again really thanking our sponsors of this, our first Digital State of the Nation, KPMG, who've been doing the fantastic drawings, NBN Co and Stellar. These are three of our national members who support us a lot, and we greatly appreciate it, not just through their sponsorship, but through engagement in the work that we do and working with our people to produce the sorts of content and events that we do. So thank you so much. I've already said thanks to our speakers, but it has been great. We can't do what we do without your valuable contributions, both your insights, but also your time and your openness and generosity in how you share those insights, and the preparedness to be so open and honest with our audience. The topics we've covered in the last 2 days are, of course, critical to Australia's future, to our economic recovery, and to the longer-term outlook, both from a social and economic development perspective. You can expect to see them coming through in our research programs, in our future events, and also in how we advocate and talk about issues just more broadly. To the almost 3,000 live stream viewers and representatives of our members, of our member organisations and the media, thank you for engaging. Thank you for following us on social media and contributing through social media your thoughts and ideas, and for dropping your questions into the Pigeonhole app, which I have to say makes life very interesting when you're facilitating, both in terms of juggling those things, but it does give you a different perspective on what's on people's minds and the sorts of issues that we should be addressing. You can, of course, continue to engage through social media. Involve us at CEDA_news, keep tweeting hashtag SON2020, and of course be in touch with us more broadly at any stage. What else have I got to say? Of course, I've got to put a plug in for the work that we do on an ongoing basis. If you go and have a look at our website, CEDA.com.au, you'll see the breadth and depth of the content that we've sought to put out, particularly during this COVID crisis, recognising how much people are interested in trying to understand not just the pandemic itself, but what it means to our economy, to our businesses, and to the community at large. And so we've really put a lot of effort into making sure we can connect you to a really broad range of thoughts there. So go and have a look on the website. There's blogs, there's podcasts, and there's just a heap of live streams that we've already done that you'll probably find interesting. If you haven't had enough, I'll pause. If you haven't had enough of us for the last 2 days, we do have a live stream coming up this Thursday. It's addressing the issue of Australia's competitiveness. Obviously relates to many of the issues we've talked about for the last couple of days. CEDA is, of course, the Australian partner of the IMD World Competitiveness Ranking, and their 2020 results are coming out tonight. So the live stream later this week is going to address those issues. And it is going to involve insights from Swiss-based Professor Arturo Briz. He was out here in Australia for EPO earlier this year. People gave us a lot of positive feedback about him. So Jared's going to be speaking with him about the competitiveness results, how we fare and how we compare with our Asia-Pacific neighbours in particular. So again, CEDA.com.au to get details and to log in there. And if that's not enough, Tuesday the 23rd of June, I'm going to be chatting on the National Economic Outlook with Westpac Chief Economist Bill Evans. Anyone who follows the Australian economy knows Bill's been around forever. I've said that to him myself, so he won't mind. But he will have just a wealth of insights on where we are at the moment and what he thinks the future is going to look like. So I am going to stop now. Thank you again for participating over the last 2 days. Can I also just say a big call out to the CEDA team? You've done a fantastic job. Really appreciate it, and have a good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much.